Good morning. Thank you, DJB Diamond, for getting us pumped for day 2 of the SIP conference. I'm Carmen Hopkins, Director of Supporting Innovative Practices from the Riverside County Office of Education. Whether you're joining us for the first time today or you're back for more, welcome to day 2 of the 4th annual SIP conference. Pump it up, elevating voices and belonging. A huge thank you to our partners at El Dorado and Riverside County Offices of Education, and to the California Department of Education for believing in this work and challenging us to be innovative, inclusive, and impactful. Yesterday was packed with insight and inspiration. We heard from the disability community, we explored tools for instruction and IEPs, and we looked at how to build educational systems rooted in belonging and student success. One highlight, The Ride Ahead, a moving documentary from our keynote speakers, Dan and Samuel Habib. You can still watch it, just head to the auditorium and click the movie poster. The film will be available until midnight tonight, so plan your Friday night dinner and movie now. A few quick reminders to help you navigate the platform today. Accessibility tools are available. Just click the blue circle icon in the top right of your screen. We've enabled closed captioning, ASL interpretation, and Spanish translation throughout the event today. And if you have any questions, just head over to the information desk for support. Also, don't forget to check out the conference leaderboard. Earn points for attending sessions, visiting booths, and engaging in the social lounge. The top 10-point earners will earn admission to the 2025 MTSS Professional Learning Institute or the 2025 CalExi Symposium. Winners will be announced via email after the conference. Now let's get into today's amazing lineup. I'm excited to pass the mic to our amazing SIP coordinator, Janelle Mercado.
Thank you so much, Carmen, and good morning, everyone. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome and introduce you to our Day 2 opening keynote speaker, Dr. Erik Carter. Over the past year, our SIP team has deeply engaged with one of Dr. Carter's powerful frameworks, the dimensions of belonging, as part of our professional learning. So to say that we're thrilled to have him here with us today is truly an understatement. If you've gone to any of our professional learning this year, no doubt you've seen this framework. Dr. Carter is a professor and Luther Sweet Endowed Chair in Disabilities at Baylor University and serves as Executive Director of the Baylor Center for Developmental Disabilities. His research focuses on advancing inclusion and fostering true belonging in schools, workplaces, and faith communities for individuals with disabilities across the lifespan. He is a prolific scholar, having authored more than 300 articles, chapters, and publications in the field of education, transition services, and inclusive practices. As you listen to today's keynote, we invite you to share your thoughts and submit any questions using the chat feature for the Q&A session that will follow. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Erik Carter.
Thank you, Janelle. And Carmen, thank you for everyone who's been part of hosting the SIP conference. It sounds like yesterday was extraordinary, and I now have Friday evening plans to watch a great, compelling documentary. But what a pleasure it is to be with all of you among so many educators and school leaders and service providers, parents, advocates from across California and around the country who I know are so deeply invested in the flourishing of students with and without disabilities. This, I think, is the work that matters most as we really strive to create classrooms and schools and districts in which learning and relationships go hand in hand, where every student belongs. And that's my passion as well. So I'm really excited to see how we might really move our communities in this direction from exclusion to embrace. I'm coming to you from Waco, Texas, so greetings on behalf of my colleagues at Baylor University. I've been a professor and a researcher for nearly 25 years now, and so much of my work focuses broadly on helping schools and workplaces and congregations and communities be places where people with and without disabilities can learn and live and learn and serve and worship and work all in community with one another. I think as we think about schools, particularly today, it's really about making sure that our classrooms are marked by rigor and by relevance and by relationships for students with and without disabilities alike, particularly for students who have more extensive support needs. We want to create schools where learning and belonging abound together. So we're going to reflect together over the next hour or so on what it might look like to move in ways that help more and more of our students experience that assurance of belonging in their schools, among their peers, in places where we start to move beyond often what is just this thin veneer of inclusion. It looks like it, but when you peel it back, it's really not that. Things that look like inclusion, but are really more counterfeits. We want to move past that into this deeper place of real learning and relationships together. And it's not easy work. It's not recipe work, but it is the work that matters most. So let's dive in beyond inclusion, creating communities of belonging together. And this is work that matters so much for the more than 7 million students receiving special education services all around the country, about a tenth of whom, about 750,000 children and youth with disabilities in elementary and secondary schools all throughout California. For those students, how do we think about fostering communities of deep learning, but also of deep relationships? And I think, I've not met you all. I can't even see you all wherever you are, but I think we hold some core commitments in common. We want our students to feel at home in their classrooms, to really feel like true members of their schools, to feel valued and accepted and needed by their peers and by their teachers. And so many of us who are practitioners are striving to create the kind of connections among our students that lead to relationships and friendships. Every one of those 7 million students around the country should know for certain that they belong. But what does it look like to make that a reality? And that's the question that we have to wrestle with, because we're having this conversation today because belonging can be so elusive for so many students in our midst, particularly those who have more extensive support needs. We can't automatically assume it. It's not always experienced. And it seems like in a lot of our efforts in schools to foster relationships seem to come at the back end or take a back seat to our efforts to focus on academic and behavioral outcomes. In other words, relationships often are the thing we might get to if we can get to it. And so that means many of our students find themselves on the peripheries of social circles and on school life. So how do we change that landscape? How do we begin to bend the storylines of students towards relationships and friendships, and do that in ways that fosters rich learning opportunities? My accent today will be on students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The students that I served when I began my teaching career as a high school transition teacher. But I think you're going to quickly see that the framework that I share has relevance to all of our students with disabilities, and may actually be key to fostering belonging for any student in our midst, whether or not they have a disability. So let's dive in. And to set the stage for this conversation, I want to share a little bit of historical context that comes from our fields of education and also special education. And I know that for many of you, this is going to be common knowledge if you've been in this field for a long time. And some of you, this has been your lived experience if you're a family member or a young person who's disabled. But for some of you, this might be new. And I often find that looking backwards at the history of our field and our work and our schools helps us maybe see where we want to go next. And I'm going to use some imagery that maybe you've seen variations of elsewhere. So in my own lifetime of now 52 years, the ways we've thought about schooling for students with developmental disabilities has changed pretty dramatically. At the time that I was born in the early 1970s, so many students with disabilities found themselves wholly excluded from public education, not just schools, but so many other corners of our community. So if you imagine the picture on your screen is a school or any other kind of community, we would say there were holes. There are too many students who were still missing. As we started to pursue advocacy efforts and school reform efforts, we passed new laws, we launched new policies. We saw opportunities open up for students with disabilities, but they tended to be opened up in largely segregated contexts, entirely apart from anyone else who didn't have a similar disability label. And it's a strong word, but I think it's a fitting word for the prevailing models of schooling. Separate special education schools. Those students then graduated to specialized day programs or sheltered workshops or institutional living. And what that meant is that most students without disabilities would grow up and receive their education in the absence of their peers with disabilities. And think about what that means in terms of leading communities or congregations or corporations. How do you lead communities well when you've grown up in the absence of indispensable members of those communities? Well, over time, of course, the landscape changed even further. I think about the times that I was in middle school and high school and then college in the 1980s and the 1990s. That shift was towards integrating or mainstreaming students within the ordinary aspects of school and community life. And this was incredible progress, but the opportunities that opened up still involved a certain separation. And that you'll notice that even in the image, there's a certain separation there. It was different classes down a rarely traveled hallway in the school. They grew up into large group homes, tucked into untraveled parts of town, or working in enclaves that placed people with developmental disabilities near, but not really among their coworkers or peers without disabilities. Notice the difference between those two words, between being near one another and being among one another. Well, that takes us to the present day, where so many of our conversations focus on ensuring people with disabilities are fully included in the same classrooms and clubs, the same jobs, the same community groups as anyone else. This was part of what you heard all throughout yesterday in the keynote and elsewhere. Inclusion has been the dominant theme of the last 2 decades. There's some other words that matter here. There's a movement of prepositions as we think about communities here. On the left, we were apart from one another and shifting towards being among one another to now being with one another. And that word, that preposition, that posture makes all of the difference. So do you see the very different portraits of school or community that I've put up on the screen in these images? And we could spend a lot of time just talking about these pictures, what we notice, what we see in our own midst. But I'm sharing them for a few reasons as I kind of key up where I really want to go next with this conversation. Because what you see up on your screen actually isn't the history of the last 50 years at all, or 52 years in my life. Actually, what you see up on the screen is a map of the current landscape. You can find examples of each of these portraits of a community or school side by side in any district, in any region, in just about any state. In my new state of Texas, I've been here a couple years. I would say we are a living history museum. I could show you examples of exclusion and segregation, integration and inclusion within 1 or 2 hours of where I am right now. And I bet that's true in your corner of California. Second reason I share this is I hope these pictures prompt your reflection. As you think about the schools or the districts that you lead in or teach in or your kids attend school in, which of these portraits most closely resembles what you see? And if there's somewhere else you see yourself going, where are you headed? Where are you stuck? What would be the next destination on your journey? But the main reason that I share these images is I think there's one other place that we're really trying to push towards as we think about this movement beyond inclusion. If you spend time listening closely to the stories and hopes and desires and wishes of young people with disabilities and their families, what you discover is they want to be more than just integrated. They want to be more than just included. They want to experience belonging. Right? And we all have this longing to belong. I think it means that we've become these communities, if we've arrived, where we start to see one another in fundamentally different ways. It's not that there's two groups of students, those who have disabilities and those who don't, those who have labels and those who don't, those who are the members or the strangers or the ins or the outs. We start to see our school or community as one incredibly diverse group of young people, every person of equal and immeasurable value. So we come to see one another differently in those kinds of communities. But it also means that we also start to relate to one another differently. That we don't just share space for a few hours each day as we go to classes and lunch and cafeteria and all these sorts of things, but actually relationships start to form. We stay involved in each other's lives after class ends and after the school bell rings or after we clock out of work. We become knitted in relationship together. Friendships are born out of shared encounters, and we're no longer living parallel lives. That's very different than mere integration or inclusion. And I think there's a key difference that we want to call out here as we talk through this. I think the difference between inclusion and belonging for our students is the difference between just being present and actually having a real presence in that community. And for our schools, it's the difference between welcoming students who might arrive to our class or club or whatever we lead, and actually aching because of their absence, actually missing students who aren't there and pursuing their presence. This is the picture of belonging that we want our schools to be about. And it's a beautiful word. And in fact, we use the word belonging all the time now, but I think it's important to really push into what we mean when we say that. How could the schools that we work in or lead in become places where belonging is really, truly experienced by our students with disabilities, or for any student who has been or felt excluded? And if we're going to push in that direction, we have to know what we mean when we say belonging. And here's a real challenge, right? I mean, belonging is one of those things that's easy to say we should be about, but it's a really hard thing to define. And it's one of those things that we know when we experience it. Man, we know the deep joy we experience when we're in a place of belonging. And we know viscerally how we feel when we don't. But yeah, what are the markers of a community that are living this out for all students? And I think one sort of point of reference that could be helpful for all of you, and in fact, I'm going to encourage you to find the chat, webinar chat right now as I pose this question. But I think one of the answers comes when we reverse the question, like what does belonging look like for students with disabilities? We should ask the question, what does belonging look like for anyone? So if I were to ask you to think about a place where you experience belonging, you personally, maybe it's your workplace or your neighborhood or your faith community or your family or some affinity group, what would you point to that tells you you belong there? So find your chat and actually finish the sentence that I've started at the top of the screen here. I know I belong when blank. And I'd love to see how you fill that sentence in. And it might give us some hints into how we might think about belonging for our students in our midst as we think about that. So take a moment and add that. I'll call some of these out: when I'm heard, when I'm understood, when I'm loved, when my heart rate is normal, when I'm respected, when I'm seen, when I feel safe, when I experience joy, when I can just be me, right? Keep those coming in, because I think that begins to give us a glimpse into the sorts of postures and practices we might adopt in schools as we think about belonging for our students. And I'm going to let those just roll in as we go, because this is the question that has really captivated our work and our research and our partnerships with schools. As we strive to foster belonging in our schools, what will tell us when we've arrived? Well, I think there's a a lot that we can learn from research and practice about what leads to belonging. I want to be really clear. I am not here to tell you what the definitive word is on the subject. I am curious. I'm a learner. And what I do is I listen and I look at what's happening in our schools to try to uncover the answer to this question. So what I'd like to do is, rather than share my views on what belonging is to take you into what we've been learning from the large collection of studies that we've been doing with young people with disabilities, with their families, through interviews and surveys and observations, as we begin to think about what belonging looks like and means for our students. And here's what we've heard and seen and learned. That from the perspective of our students and their families, to belong is 10 key dimensions. It is to be present and to be invited. It's to be welcomed and to be known, to be accepted, to be supported. It's to be heard and to be befriended. It's to be needed, and it's to be loved. And when each of these areas is addressed well, schools are much more likely to become learning environments in which students with disabilities thrive and are seen as valued and indispensable members of their learning community. So we're going to walk through this 10 dimensions of belonging as we go. I want to talk about what each means and why they matter. I'll share some snapshots of studies along the way, but I really want to encourage this to be a time of reflection for you and your schools. And as you think about the communities that you're part of, that you lead in or teach in, ask yourself in each of these 10 areas, what are you seeing done really well right now that you can celebrate and hold up and continue and invest in deeper? But let me encourage you to think about how you actually know you're doing well in these areas. What do you notice? What do you collect? What do you gather that might convince you or convince others that each of these dimensions of belonging is experienced? And maybe out of this, you start to notice things that you could do better or differently, or maybe even next. So there is a reflection tool that's now, I see, has been dropped into the chat. You can download this. You could use this with your teams at school. And let's walk through each of these 10 dimensions of belonging as we think about what practices and policies aim in these directions. We're going to start with presence, because belonging always begins with being present. It's built on this foundation of shared experiences, repeated encounters over time, to just be involved each and every day in the same places as anyone else in the life of your school. And I think it's just about being part of the fabric of everyday school life, just like anyone else. And yet it's hard to feel like you belong if you are never or rarely part of all the activities and events that make up the life of a community, if you're always from the outside looking in. So kids with and without disabilities should be part of the same classrooms and hallways and playgrounds and cafeterias and clubs, and encountering one another as they learn and play and connect together. In other words, the presence of students with disabilities should be natural and expected in every school. And we know about 1 in 7 students in our schools has a disability that impacts their learning and relationships. For some of those students, that impact may be quite substantial, readily apparent even. For others, those needs might be much less visible or evident only in certain areas. But it raises a point of reflection for us as we peek into our classrooms and courtyards and clubs. What does that look into those places tell us about the presence of students with disabilities in the life of our schools? Are those students on the peripheries of what we offer, or are they there right at the center alongside others? We do have some data that speaks to presence. Now, most of the school day is spent in a pretty wide range of interesting academic and elective and related arts classes. We don't have data on whether they're interesting, actually. I shouldn't have said that. We do have data, though, on whether students with disabilities are in those same classes alongside their peers. And what you start to see as I put these data up is that absence from learning opportunities alongside peers without disabilities is much more common than presence in those classrooms. So this is the percentage of students with various disability categories placed in different educational settings in California. You can easily access national data on this as well if you're from elsewhere. The blue is the percentage of students who spend most or all of their day in separate schools or other settings outside of the local public school. It's about 8% of students with intellectual disability, about 5% of those with autism. This is the percent in green of students who spend most or all of their day outside of general education classrooms, in special education classrooms, less than 40% of the day, or entirely outside of the general education class. What you see in California is that's 2/3 of all students have very limited presence in their general education classrooms. The yellow is the mix of students who spend time in general education and special education, between 40 and 80% of their day. And the orange is the percentage of students who are spending most or all of their day in general education classrooms. What you start to see is that so much of people's day for students with developmental disabilities is spent apart from so many of their peers. And what's interesting as you look at these patterns, for example, across the country, is what you start to see is that there are very wide variations from state to state in terms of how much time students with particular disabilities spend in typical classrooms. What I put up on the screen is the percentage of students with disabilities who are served in regular classes for 80% to 100% of the day. And you'll see it ranges from all the way down to 20% in New Jersey, all the way up to 82% in Vermont. And you'll see where California is noted. And yeah, you named the point, Catherine. What are those two states doing differently? Because the kids aren't different in those states. And we say similar variations in state-by-state patterns as we think about students with intellectual disability, again, who are spending a mix of time to all of their time in general education classrooms. It ranges from 20% in Florida to 80% in Vermont, and everything in between. And just as that comment in the chat noted, it raises some interesting questions that prompt our reflection about those patterns. Mike Giangreco, who is retired from the University of Vermont, the state that showed up all the way on the right, he, I think, made a really provocative observation based on these types of patterns. And he said, for every student who remains educationally segregated, there are other students with similar attributes and abilities and needs who are successfully included. And that simple fact suggests that whether a student with a disability is meaningfully included may have less to do with his or her characteristics and more to do with the attitudes, the skills, the structures, and the practices of all of us, of those adults responsible for providing education. I read this actually as hopeful, not as critical, because there are values and there are practices and commitments that we can adopt as teachers and schools that begin to bend those patterns towards greater presence. I hope this prompts your collective reflection as you think about your school and whether kids with disabilities are present in all the places that other peers are present. What is it that maybe stands in the way of that presence? What are the barriers that you might have to break down? Are there barriers of awareness or training? Maybe it's barriers of attitude or expectation, barriers of finance, barriers of resource, of commitment, of values. Or maybe it's just the narrow boundaries of our imagination that we have to figure out how to expand and grow. And this matters, right? I love the comment, barriers in our systems, not in the kids, because they desire this involvement. But this is really important because presence is the starting point for belonging. It's the baseline in many ways, but it's not the destination. This is just mere integration. We have to press deeper as we think about moving forward. So it's a place to reflect on your own schools as you think about presence in the communities that you care about. What's going really well? What could be better or different? What might you do next? And how do you know, as you think about your schools, who might be missing? Well, the antidote to absence is often invitation. It's to be invited, to be pursued. There's something so powerful about getting picked by someone else. There's something deeply wounding when we aren't picked by someone else. And so to know that others want to be in your midst, that you're company is desired, maybe even needed, that is key to belonging. So when others seek out your presence or your participation, it sends a powerful message to kids with disabilities. We want you here. We need your presence. It just wouldn't be the same here without you. And of course, we're mandated to invite all students, including kids with disabilities, into the doors of our schools. But students mean more than that here. We want invitations to abound for students in our schools, to be asked by peers to sit together at lunch, to join in games at recess, to collaborate on a project in class, to come to a birthday party, to attend a sleepover. And those sorts of invitations that we know matter so much can be so very rare for so many of our students. Consider these data from an earlier iteration of the National Longitudinal Transition Study in the United States. These are now about dozen-year old. We haven't had a more recent version since. But they found that half of teenagers with autism had not been invited to the social activities of any other youth, not once in the last year. 51%. The same is true for 1 in 4 youth with intellectual disability. Right? How do we ensure those invitations begin to abound? And teachers play a role in this too. How could teachers be active in inviting students with disabilities to join extracurricular clubs, to attend inclusive field trips, to contribute on service projects, not to be service projects, to have leadership roles, to take part in other school activities? Belonging begins when those kinds of invitations become an everyday occurrence from peers, from teachers, from others in our schools. Do invitations to students with disabilities abound in your schools? What are you doing really well? What could be different or better? Who is longing for that kind of invitation? Well, third, belonging involves being welcomed. It's the ways that students are greeted and treated by others that says a lot about their place within a school community. So to be welcomed, it's just to be received with warmth, with a friendliness. There's an authentic delight. People find pleasure in your presence. And here, most of the data that we have is qualitative. It comes from interviews with students about how they feel when they are at school. And I think that's a good thing. That should be the source of our data on being welcomed, because it's not the host who determines what's welcoming, it's the guest, right? Just because we as teachers think we've created a welcoming community, it's actually the students who communicate back to us whether that is so. We have to see our school culture through the lens of our students. And students tell us that they feel welcomed in kind of ordinary ways, like when others greet them and strike up a conversation, sit with them at lunch, ask about their day, remember their birthday, join them in shared activities, and notice when they're not there and follow up to find out why. These are ordinary actions that send a powerful message to people that they're wanted. And the extent to which our students genuinely feel welcomed in their classrooms and their school, that can elevate their enthusiasm for learning. And so when hospitality abounds, if I don't know that we think about hospitality in schools a lot, but students get way more excited about coming to class each day. And when it's absent, that's when they feel uncomfortable or express more reluctance. I think there's a role for us as staff as we think about the sense of welcome that we communicate. When we are uncertain about what to say or do or not say or not do, or peers feel that way, they become more reluctant to interact with students who maybe have more extensive support needs. So as staff, where could we provide information or guidance or modeling? How do we show peers what it looks like to converse with someone who has complex communication challenges, or to work collaboratively with someone whose support needs are more extensive? And some of our staff may need guidance on how to engage with students who may communicate differently or behave in unfamiliar ways, or guidance on how to talk about disability in respectful and relevant ways, or maybe even just guidance on how to design their instruction in spaces with a much wider range of students in mind. How do we begin to equip our staff to welcome well? And as we think about the students in our schools and we reflect on this idea of being welcomed, it raises the question of who still needs an extravagant welcome in our schools, and what would it look like to welcome these students really, really well. Well, a fourth aspect of belonging involves being known. And kids love to hear their names, right? Shouted across the room, uttered from the other end of a phone or text message, called out from a group, right? We long to hear our names. It reminds me of the old sitcom Cheers, right? Of where the theme song was, we all want to go where everybody knows our name, right? Where they're always glad you came. But the joy of being known here isn't merely about that. It's more than just being noticed and recognized by name. It's about being understood deeply and personally, to be seen as a unique individual, to be appreciated for all of who you are. There's something about having relationships with people who understand you and know you that's important to this sense of belonging. And yet we have students in our schools who feel like strangers in their own schools. And if you're spending most or all of your school day in separate classrooms, or you're always on the edges or peripheries of school and classroom activities, it means the opportunities you have to develop relationships with other students, with other staff, to become known, those opportunities just become far more limited. So part of this dimension of belonging is whether students with disabilities are known by others in their school. That matters. But interestingly, what really came out in our studies around this dimension of belonging is not merely whether students with disabilities are known, but actually how they come to be known. And this is a point I think worth parking on just a little bit longer, because the labels that we use as educators so often categorize students, the ways we use those, whether it's a learning disability or intellectual disability or autism, shapes how children come to be known. And if you look at our definitions, what you see very quickly is they define people by their struggles rather than by their strengths. We define people based on their challenges more than we do by their contributions. And you see that in prevailing definitions. If we only know students in terms of these portraits, boy, that actually flattens the rich picture of who our students are and how they come to be known. If you've ever seen the wonderful TED Talk on the danger of telling a single story about someone, that happens here all the time. There's one story about disability we tell, and yet it's equally true that our students with disabilities have incredible strengths and talents and personalities and character and interests that are exciting to get to know just like anyone else. How do we come to know our students well and rightly, and I think faithfully, by the strengths and the gifts and the passions and the positive qualities that they bring to their relationships, that they bring to their learning communities? Can we come to know students by the things that remind us that they're absolutely indispensable, and not by things that imply they're somehow incapable, by their strengths and contributions and the gifts they have to receive? And so I think this is really important because we talk about strengths-based postures all the time, but so rarely do we actually communicate those to a watching world. It reminds me of a study we did now about 10 years ago, where we actually asked 500 parents of adolescents with intellectual and developmental disabilities to complete an assessment. Actually, it's called the Assessment Scale for Positive Character Traits. The scale has 26 different statements that address the extent to which their child exhibits characteristics like kindness or humor or gratitude or empathy or optimism or courage or forgiveness. I thought it'd be interesting to just see what parents said when we asked them to describe whether these traits are like their son or daughter. 93% said their child was happy. 86% said they enjoyed life and were grateful for life's simple pleasures. They had a great sense of humor. They were thoughtful and helpful to others. Most said their child demonstrated care for others and were just thankful for all the things that life had to offer. Many said their daughter or son was bothered or concerned or upset when someone else was uncomfortable or distressed. They said their kids were courageous, that they bounced back easily, that they were resilient. And this was a study of adolescence. So only about 2/3 said their teenager was quick to forgive. But you get the picture here. This is a portrait of strengths. And then when we interviewed families about the strengths they saw, they talked about their children being compassionate and social or loving or helpful or loyal. They shared examples of their children's dedication and resilience and self-determination. They talked about talents and skills and hobbies and passions and so many other positive traits. The question for us is, if we know someone's strengths or gifts, can we find a place for those things in our schools and in our communities? If I think about like how many schools would be enriched by finding a place known for their gratitude and empathy or kindness, or how many peers would be eager to develop a friendship with someone who's funny and happy and thoughtful. All the traits that I put up on the screen previously, these are the things that our students possess. These are the enviable traits we try to cultivate in all of our students. How do we come to make sure those strengths are known and shared with others in our school? I think this is a really interesting place of reflection as you think about your students and what strengths and talents come to mind for you. A really interesting place to notice this, and we do this a lot in our research, is what would you conclude about a student if all you read was their IEP? Would it be a portrait of strengths and talents and gifts, or something else altogether? So I think that schools that are committed to belonging really strive to learn each student's story and to know their interests and their passions and their skills. And the better we come to know our students in these ways, actually the better position we are to support them, to help connect them to others, to be befriended and needed and loved in these areas. So to be known is to be seen as this unique individual, to be appreciated for all of who you are. The question in your schools is, who is not well known or who is not known well? And what role could you play in helping students become better known by others in their midst? Well, fifth is to be accepted. It's one thing to be included. It's a very different thing to be accepted. And we love in our interviews with families, I know many of you are parents who are part of this conference as well. We love talking with families about their experiences of inclusion of their children with disabilities. And the quotes that we hear from them can often be beautiful. They talk about their children or their youth being, these are the quotes we hear, welcomed without condition, treated like family, embraced for all of who they are. And those are quotes we love to hear. We want to hear those over and over from families. And yet, families also share with us the quote that they hear from often their schools. And even though sort of those progression of that progression of history that I shared just a little while, although things have changed dramatically, we are a long way from that assurance of acceptance. And a lot of the same prejudices and stereotypes and stigma that exist elsewhere in our culture, in our world, they seep into our schools too. So the quotes that families share with us that they hear back are things like, well, we don't really do inclusion here at this school. We're just not equipped to serve your child. Maybe you'd feel more comfortable at a place with a special program for her. We aren't really sure he'll get much out of being part of our typical classrooms, or behaviors that are a bit of a distraction. And well, students like her are served best in our self-contained classrooms. Students like her, what are the attitudes that pervade your schools? What are the quotes that you hear as we think about inclusion and belonging? And yet schools are these rare communities where you get the lives of all kinds of students from so many different backgrounds, kind of intersecting, converging in one place. And so I hope as students learn and play alongside one another each day, they encounter other kids whose characteristics and experiences and circumstances differ dramatically sometimes from their own. Promoting acceptance amidst that kind of diversity, that's central to belonging. To be accepted is to be embraced gladly, as we saw in the quote, without condition, viewed as an equal. It doesn't mean that anything goes, but our acceptance is unconditional of who these kids are, their deep value, and their worth as well. And shifting attitudes is really hard work. It's long haul work, but actually, as a field, we do know a lot about the pathways to changing attitudes. We know that there is a place for sharing accurate information and providing education related to disability. So there's an awareness and informational component. It can be good to host activities for students and staff and families that raise awareness or increase understanding. There's also power in what each of us model to others, and there's power in the stories that we tell, right? And when we hold high expectations and we support shared activities and we're using respectful language, and I think attitudes come to be shifted. But it actually turns out that the investments we make in fostering friendships and promoting inclusive activities, that's actually what has the most substantial impact on the attitudes and views that others hold. In other words, research bears this out so often that personal contact is the way we promote acceptance. So when we look at attitude change across so many different groups and so many different areas, the most promising pathway for changing views about people with disabilities is to support shared activities and interactions. And it seems like almost counterintuitive, like you have to have acceptance first in a sense. But I think what we're learning is acceptance doesn't come merely from learning about someone. It comes from coming to know someone personally and deeply. And that's when your preconceived ideas about whoever is the stranger or the other in your life actually start to get overturned. It's actually through creating encounters that we begin to transform attitudes. And I think this is a really challenging but important place and a call for more integrated and inclusive practices. To be accepted is to be embraced gladly. It's to be viewed as an equal. How are you doing in your schools? Where are your asterisks that need to be removed before those postures of unacceptance come to be sort of melted away? Well, 6 is support, and support is critical to belonging. I think our real capabilities aren't evident in what we can do on our own, despite everything our culture says about that, but actually rather in what we can do when given the right opportunities and the right support, right? To be supported is to have the individualized resources you need to reach your potential, to thrive in your learning and life. And the students that we work with as whether you're a special educator or related service provider, they need additional support to be part of their life of their school fully in all those ways. That might include academic assistance in classes, social supports during non-instructional time, behavioral supports across the school day, emotional support as a form of care. And for some of our students, that support is going to be occasional. It's going to be pretty modest. And for some of our students, that support is going to have to be ongoing and substantial and deep. The point I want to make here is it's the provision of that individualized support that becomes the tangible demonstration of our commitment to those students' learning and to their belonging. Support communicates a desire for presence, right? It's the absence of support that almost always is what leads to exclusion or limits meaningful participation. So schools that are marked by belonging see this delivery of individualized support as a core commitment. And I'm not speaking here about kind of a compliance mindset, but really where we see compliance as the floor rather than the ceiling. That we're really thinking deeply about what support does this student need to be part of these critical experiences and relationships during the school day. And this is the place for asking really good questions. This is the place we avoid assumptions because the best supports are always individualized and they're always contextualized, right? They're determined one student at a time and kind of one place at a time. So supportive schools are using person-centered planning approaches to figure out which supports are going to be beneficial for which students. They're building the capacity of all staff to support a diversity of students well in their classes and clubs and programs. They're encouraging and equipping peers to be natural supports to their schoolmates. And they're regularly revisiting these supports over time to make sure they're continuing to work well, that they're the right supports for the right time. And I think that we're pretty good at supports as special educators or in our systems, but so often I think we think about supports in sometimes pretty narrow ways. We tend to think about supports that all of us provide as adults or professionals or paraprofessionals. And so, at least for students with more extensive support needs, we're kind of prone to surround them with paraprofessionals and related service providers and special education staff and therapists in ways that often happen to the near exclusion of peers and other forms of natural support. Here's another data point that's, I think, kind of interesting. It's the number of paraprofessionals around the country compared to the number of special educators across the country. And this is just a 20-year kind of portrait of the green line, the number of paraprofessionals increasing, the blue line, the number of special educators kind of wavering, such that if you walk into a school now, you're more likely to run into a paraprofessional than a certified special ed teacher. And so often, this is the model of support, that one-to-one paraprofessional that's being requested by general educators and special educators and many parents as well. There's a risk that we run here, though, when we are assigning so often the least trained staff and often the least paid staff to students with the greatest support needs. And there's not actually good evidence that this approach gets us where we want to go, especially when it comes to belonging. If we rely entirely on us, we're crowding out peers. We're overlooking much more natural sources of support in the process. My own research line for the last 20 years has really looked at 3 practical ways of involving peers in supporting students with disabilities in inclusive classrooms or cafeterias or extracurriculars or community settings. All of these rely on critical role of paraprofessionals and others, but they involve those paraprofessionals as facilitators of interaction and participation rather than the sole source of support. And that's really the difference that we're talking about. When we engage peers much more actively in learning and social connections, we see noticeable advantages to when students with significant disabilities receive support from exclusively from adults. And how are you engaging all of your students in these types of ways? I'm going to have a session on this a bit later on, but one of that lines of work we do is really thinking about what happens in the classroom as we think about connecting students with other peers who can learn alongside them, be classmates and group mates and project mates as they work together in the classroom. Those peers need some guidance on how to do that well, and they all need support as they work together to make sure that they're learning well together and relationships are forming out of this. So there's so many ways to think about engaging peers. But I also just want to really encourage you to think not just about the classroom and the class time, but actually to think as much about the between class times as well. How do you think about hallways and lunch and recess and homeroom and buses, to think about peer networks and peer partner programs that connect students intentionally in these kinds of social experiences? If we're not intentional about these kinds of relationships, they just don't happen automatically. Our team has developed a number of free resources on peer-mediated practices that are available through the TIES Center. The link is in the handouts. We'll put that in the chat here in a minute. My point in all of this is to think intentionally about support, but don't think too narrowly about only adult-delivered supports. How do we involve peers, coworkers, classmates, fellow congregation members, neighbors, and others in providing the support students need to be part of everyday school and community life? The question for you is, what is needed to make meaningful participation possible? Well, 7th is to be heard, and everyone wants to be listened to and understood. To know that your voice is valued isn't just empowering, it actually helps you feel more connected to others. And this is about students just having their perspectives sought out and listened to and respected. It promotes their self-determination. It lifts their self-worth. It contributes to a sense of belonging. So for any student, when they feel heard at school, it reminds them that they're important, that their voice matters. They have ideas to contribute. They have a seat at the table, right? They're valued. And this is really important because the perspective of students, particularly with developmental disabilities, are often not sought out. And yet, best practices really emphasize making sure that young people have a say in their lives and their learning. And so, how are we thinking about providing our students opportunities to build the skills and capacities and to practice opportunities to share their preferences, to share their perspectives with others? That might be in the classroom. Think about all the ways that might happen, or in leading their own IEP meeting, or elsewhere. The better our students understand themselves, their strengths, their needs, their gifts, their interests, their goals. When they understand those things and they know their communities better, they're much more better positioned to advocate for themselves, to advocate for others as well. And for those of you who are parents, we have a wonderful guide for you that really can give you some ideas for how you might foster the kinds of skills and dispositions that equip young people to be heard in their communities and elsewhere. We have a guide on fostering self-determination among children with disabilities that are ideas that come from parents and for parents. And this is a free download you can take a look at and think about what role you might have at home to help position your children to have a voice and to be effective in sharing that voice, even when they may not share that voice through words, because communication can happen in so many ways, but that their perspective is sought out and respected and honored. The reflection question here is really, who never has a seat at the table? And what might we do to ensure that students with developmental disabilities can be more part of those conversations and contributions in their schools? Well, eighth, belonging is rooted in relationships. It's about having people in our lives who know us and like us and accept us, who miss us, who love us. That's at the heart of well-being. And that's just as true for students with developmental disabilities. Their desire for friendship and supportive relationships is not different. It's not diminished. It's grounded in this core belief that we thrive most in community. So having a friend is just about having someone else in your life who says, I choose you back. And we know the key role of friendships in our contributions to well-being, the way they give meaning to our lives and make us who we are and help us navigate challenges and bring joy. If you're going to summarize all the research in this space around being befriended, it's simply that it's just not good to be alone, right? There's so many things that align to just how impactful it is to be lonely or isolated or disconnected. And this is where it gets really important and for us as we think about our schooling, because everything else I've talked about, you can almost do kind of at arm's length. Like, I mean, you can be welcoming, you can be accepting, you can arrange supports, but friendships takes belonging deeper. It's all about relationships. And yet for so many of our students, alone is what we often see. As we think about their social circles and we start to name all the people that they know in their lives, we see kind of narrow relationships so often. So think about your own relationships for yourself. You probably have family members. I think you would have names of friends and close companions, I hope. You have people in your life that are neighbors, coworkers, we would say occasionals or acquaintances. And you've got people who are paid to be in your life, right? Your doctor, your auto mechanic, your principal, your boss. I expect names would abound for you as you think about your own social circles. What's really interesting is we start to compare the social circles of youth or middle school students or even kids with and without developmental disabilities. We don't tend to see differences in the number of names that go up in those circles. What we really tend to see is differences in which circles those names go in. So for many of our students with developmental disabilities, we see lots of names in the family circle and lots of names in that circle of professionals and paid supports. But the circles of friends and close companions can be narrow or few or fleeting. And this isn't just anecdotal. The research that I referenced earlier in this talk bears this out. It's not that kids with disabilities have a shortage of relationships with adults, but it's those relationships with peers that have the strongest influence on their sense of belonging. Friendships are at the heart of belonging. Their presence is enriching, their absence is wounding, and study after study finds that those relationships and friendships can be few or fleeting for so many of our kids. We have to make sure as we think about the students that we are teaching and serving and supporting that we are as intentional about relationships as we are about academics and other components of their schooling. As we think about each student on our caseload or in our midst, can we name plenty of peers that she could eat with or walk with or celebrate with or cry with or play with or pray with or shop with or catch a movie with or just do nothing with, right? I think this is so important because we call lots of things inclusion, but if there's no relationships that mark that experience, we really can't call it inclusion. You can't call it inclusive education if no one else in that class or school knows her name. And as they grow up, you can't call it a learning community or even a community if there's always people on the outside of that. So we have to think about intentionally about how do we introduce relationships into this piece of the picture. And I think here too, we know a lot about what fosters friendships. It's definitely more art than science. I absolutely agree. But if we kind of distill a lot of the work that we and others have done, what you find is relationships tend to form when kids are involved in shared activities around common interests repeated over time, right? Shared activities, common interests repeated over time. And that is where when we wrap that in having valued roles and prepared peers and just enough support, we shouldn't be surprised when students start getting picked as friends. We have to find out what each student's interests and hobbies and passions are, and make connections to other kids who love those same things, to adopt peer-mediated support models that invite and equip peers to provide some of the support that schoolmates might need, and repeat those experiences over time. I think this framework for friendship has implications for how we think about programming related to students with disabilities. You see it very quickly. If our main educational models are largely separate or segregated, then the opportunity for anyone else to pick you as a friend just becomes all the more limited. And the opportunity for anyone else in our school to encounter the friendships and all those enviable qualities that our students have, that also becomes limited. So we have to reflect deeply on friendships and being befriended and ask ourselves, who are the kids that never get picked back? And how could we create shared activities around common interests over time to begin to build those relationships? Well, ninth, the richest forms of community are marked by reciprocity among every member, where every person is seen as having skills and talents and strengths that enrich the larger community. And that's what we want for our students with disabilities, is to also be needed, to be seen as an indispensable member of our community. And every single one of us at this conference knows that every one of our students is endowed with immeasurable worth. And we also know that many of our students don't always feel valued, and some feel less needed than others. And that's so often true for our students with developmental disabilities. They're often viewed as the ones in need of support, the ones in need of assistance, but rarely do we see them as individuals whose presence and contributions enliven our communities. So this is why we want to connect our students to valued roles in their school and their community, because they come to be seen differently as a result. How do we connect them to experiences to volunteer, to take on leadership responsibilities, to help others in need, to participate in high status activities, to assist on an important project, to lead their IEP meeting, to have an after school job, right? To have a role on a team. All of these shift someone from a recipient to a contributor, and they bring the sense of significance and importance. And this is why this has to do with belonging, because when others come to encounter your strengths and your gifts and your passions, they come to need you. And then when you're not there, boy, your absence is suddenly missed. And when you're missed, that's when you know you belong, right? That's how we know when others miss our presence and long for our return. That's a marker that we're needed and valued. So who in your community needs so much to be needed? Who's always on the receiving end of support that might have an opportunity to be a support to someone else? Well, that takes us to the last of these 10 dimensions of belonging with just a few minutes left. And this is not something we talk a lot about, I think, in educational circles, but you can probably see now what love has to do with belonging, because we see that in our own lives. We know the ways we make allowances for those we love, the way we go the extra mile and extend grace and avoid what's easy and work for other people's good. Love is the thing that compels us to invite and to welcome and to know and accept and befriend and need other people, kids with and without disabilities. And when people talk about the communities that matter most to them, they talk about the love that they encounter there. So where love abounds, that's where belonging is much more likely to be experienced. And yet, we never talk about love in the professional literature. I'm pretty sure it's not an evidence-based practice. But it matters when it comes to belonging. And every person wants to be part of a community where they can love others, be loved by others. That's the kind of community where belonging is more likely to be experienced. Where do students experience the love of others in their school day and in their community? What do we do to create access to those kinds of relationships and experiences? That's the portrait of belonging that comes from students with disabilities and their families and others who've been part of our projects. And I hope it's pushing you towards this place of reflection. As you think about your schools, are students with disabilities actively and personally invited? Are they present in all aspects of the life of their school? Are they experiencing a warm welcome whenever they arrive? Are they well known by their peers and teachers? And are they known well? Are they accepted? Are they provided the support they need to participate fully and meaningfully? Are their voices sought out and honored? Are they developing and deepening relationships and friendships with others? Are they seen as needed and indispensable within that community? And are they loved deeply and unconditionally? In each of those areas, we just ask ourselves, what are we doing really well right now? What could we do better or more or differently? But how do we know? How do we know? What is telling us that our students are experiencing these aspects of belonging? Well, I hope this is intriguing to you, that it resonates with you, because here's kind of the interesting twist on all of this. Even though we've been talking about students with disabilities for the last hour or so, what's up on the screen actually strikes me less as special needs and more as ordinary needs. Universal needs more than exceptional needs. And actually, they strike me as mattering for the belonging of any student in our school, whether or not they have a disability or not. In fact, they strike me as important for staff in our schools as well. Do staff feel welcomed and known and accepted and heard and befriended and needed? So much of this is about our universal need for belonging. And in fact, as we think about how we might move in ways that foster belonging for students with disabilities, what we end up learning is how we foster belonging for anyone in our midst, for any young person, for any staff member, for any who has felt or been on the margins of their community. When we learn to invite more fully and welcome better and know more deeply and support more richly and listen more closely and befriend more generously, we end up learning how to do that for so many of the students in our midst. So I hope this is maybe a part of a journey that you see yourself as pursuing towards this deeper portrait of belonging and inclusion in our schools. And I hope it's also a time of reflection for you as you think about your own school or your own district, or maybe it's the workplace or congregation that you're part of. Which of these 5 portraits best captures the communities that you're part of? And what might be the steps that you would take to begin to move further along this journey away from exclusion and separation and segregation towards this place, not just of inclusion, but the relational components of belonging? I think, as I think about the work that most of us got in this field to do, I think this captures what really is the heart of what we're hoping to see. So I'm just really grateful for all of you, whether you're in California or elsewhere, for the work that you're doing to transform the lives of all of our students with and without disabilities, and to begin to bend their stories away from exclusion and towards embrace. I think this is the work that matters most. And I'm just really grateful to know that so many of you are allies and partners in this effort as we think about moving towards these kinds of communities. So thanks for letting me be part of this conversation, and I'll turn it back over to Juliet for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter, for that thought-provoking, engaging session on creating communities of belonging. I can't say enough. There's a lot of praises going on in the chat. We do have a few minutes for questions. And so, Dr. Carter, I'm just going to jump right in if that's okay with you.
Sure, absolutely.
Hey, so you presented some data early on in your slide deck. I believe it's slides 13 through 15. There were some questions in the chat in regards to whether that data that you shared on California, whether it includes early childhood, or is it mostly primarily K-12?
I think that was, I pulled that data from IDEAdata.org. You can download it yourself. I believe it was ages 5 through 21. So
Okay.
I'll have to double check on that, but I think that's the age span. So there may be different patterns in in serving younger kids as well.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And so the next question we have is in regards to the strengths assessment that you
Yeah.
had mentioned. I believe you shared some findings from it from slides 25 through 26. Some of our folks on our attendees want to know if you have access to that assessment and if you're able to share that out as well too.
Yeah. Well, there's a number of strength-based assessments that you can look for. That one's called the Assessment Scale for Positive Character Traits, called the Aspect Scale. It's not my scale, so I don't have the rights to send that out. But what I would love to do is point you all to it's a resource from a university I used to be part of out at Vanderbilt called Transition Tennessee. And they have an assessment database that allows you to search for assessments that focus on capturing the strengths and skills and capacities of students. And you can look for that in all kinds of areas. I'll drop that in a chat in just a moment as I pull it up. And I'll also post a link to this particular article that we mentioned where you can learn more about that assessment scale.
Thank you so much. I think our audience would love additional information so they can utilize it in their practice.
Yes.
Let's see. We have another question that came in. Oh, folks want to know, are they able to get you to come and present at their districts? How do they get in touch with Dr. Carter?
Well, yeah, I'm at Baylor University, but I would say, we've produced a lot of, and glad to consider that, but we've produced a lot of great open access resources that also guide you in these areas and have a number of different recorded presentations as well. So I think the first thing is see if any of those are really useful. And if not, love to talk with you about how we could support you further. But I think we've got enough tools to activate you to lead these conversations in your own communities. So we're glad to equip you to do that as well.
Yes, it's all about building capacity.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love that. And I'm going to drop a link to your website and also to the Center for Developmental Disabilities as well. So folks have that available to them.
Yeah.
Let me scan to see if there are any other additional questions before we close out today. What would you say? So for educators who are on the call, what would you say, given all the rich content that you shared, what is something that they can do tomorrow to start creating communities of belonging at either their school site or within their classroom? What's something they can do tomorrow?
I hope this doesn't sound too simple, but I do think the first thing is to notice. I really, the reason we have this framework is to invite you to just look more closely and notice whether the students who are in your midst are experiencing each of those 10 dimensions of belonging. Because I think so often we just assume in our focus on the curriculum and instruction that we lose our attention to relationships and connections. And that first act of just really being reflective and noticing starts to drive us to where the need is. And then it becomes, you start to see, well, what could we start to do to make sure our students could be more present or could be better known or better supported? So I think that active reflection individually on the students that you work with is one step. But I think collectively as a school to say, how could we use this framework to think about who in our school might be not experiencing each of these dimensions of belonging and what could we do collectively to change our culture and our practices and our postures that aim more towards those. I think from there, you start to be led to all kinds of practices that you might adopt and implement. I think so often in our speed and busyness and what we hold people accountable to, we forget about the important place of belonging. So starting there is a really good first step.
Yeah, I think this is such a small step. What do you notice? What do you wonder? And then what can we do?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I
Yeah.
love that. I love that. We have 2 questions that just came into the chat. So we have some parents that might be a little hesitant to inclusion and you know, the sense of belonging. How do we help parents trust the process and believe in inclusion, especially when they've had a history of challenges with
Yeah.
having their child being fully included in any setting?
Yeah, this is a really important question because people's experiences can be widely varied. And I think I just painted a portrait of belonging that's very enticing and seems easy, and yet it's very hard and very complicated and can be very messy. So I think a couple things. One is let's keep the focus on belonging first. One of the things is we debate inclusion a lot, and nobody debates belonging. So if we begin with this question of what would it look like for my child to experience this, what are the places and ways that that might happen, I think that will lead us towards more inclusive experiences. And if we support those really well, then we can talk about continuing to grow them. So look for where in my community might I help my child experience some of these things as a starting point and not get overwhelmed with the distance between here and there and all the things that I can't change around school district policies and priorities and practices, to look for places where belonging can be lived out, and then to think about how from there begin to grow. I think families, so many families, if you're on, are probably tearful at this point because they want this so much for their kids. And so I think that's the place where we have to figure out what's that right next step to help them experience that a bit. Because we're so often so far from this place. Yeah.
I love that. And
Yeah.
it goes back to what you had mentioned earlier in your presentation. We long to
Yeah.
belong. And
Yeah.
so any parent, I think, would engage in that conversation. What would it take for my child to belong?
Yeah.
We have one more question.
Sure.
Any suggestions when a peer group has specifically, you know, had challenges with a particular student or maybe rejected a particular student to change that narrative? Like you said, the work is easier said than done. So what suggestions would you have when a peer group might be, in some essence, having a challenge with a particular student or rejecting a particular
Yeah.
student?
Well, I'm going to talk a bit about that actually in a later session as we think about fostering friendships and peer mediated. But
Yes.
you know, one thing is reverse that question. What would we do for any student who that's an experience? Like that helps us guide. And sometimes that leads us to some education and equipping for those peers. Sometimes it leads us to other peer groups as well. And, you know, I think so often when we think about kind of connecting students to relationships, we often go to the kids who volunteer or want to be. And I think our posture is a little bit different. Of we say, what is this student's interests and passions and gifts? What do they love to talk about? What do they listen to on Spotify? What do they binge watch on Netflix? Who do they root for? And how do we find kids who love those same things? And then structure connections together and see where that leads. That often avoids that thing about the groups that are not receptive or not ready. And I think our starting point is sometimes wrong. And so I think that's another, more to be said on that. But actually, for those of you who saw the reference to the TIE Center resources, we address this issue in some of the peer-based resources that we have up there about how do you pick which peers might really be receptive and excited and enamored to spend time with a particular student, even when they have challenging or peculiar behaviors, right?
I love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes, we have to know our kids in order to pivot if
Yeah.
a peer group doesn't work out.
Thanks.